Hello everybody, my name is Paul Hayes and I'm the Director of Debate at the George Washington University, and I also direct the NASA Astrobiology Debates. Welcome to the NASA Astrobiology Debates at the Dupont Summit on Science, Technology, and Environmental Policy. This round is sponsored by the NASA Astrobiology Program and is hosted by the Policy Studies Organization as an extension of the Westminster Debate Series. The NASA Astrobiology Debates are part of a year-long academic series of debates and dialogue and research projects focusing on the ethical and political questions raised in the emerging and rapidly advancing field of astrobiology. Today we will have two teams, an affirmative team and a negative team, both from the George Washington University, debating the topic that has been selected for the 2015-16 NASA Astrobiology Debates. That topic is resolved that an overriding ethical obligation to protect and preserve microbial life and ecosystems should be incorporated into international law. Today's debate is using an abbreviated format. Both teams will present speeches in favor or against the topic, followed by cross-examinations. Instead of rebuttals at the end of the debate, however, we will take some questions from the audience. Thank you, and without further ado, the affirmative team.
Before I begin, I'd like to thank you all for being here today and thank the DuPont Summit for hosting us. We're very pleased to begin. 4 billion years ago, all terrestrial life was microbial. But imagine this. Imagine that if billions of years ago, more advanced life forms had visited Earth, decided Earth looked like a great place for strip mining, and in the process of extracting natural resources, had wiped out the fragile terrestrial life forms that were just beginning to emerge. If this had happened, we wouldn't be having this conversation today. Instead of a world filled with diverse life and all of the beauty that this life entails, Earth would be one more dead rock orbiting the sun. Katie and I believe that if, or as seems increasingly likely, when extraterrestrial microbial life is discovered, we have an obligation to make sure it is protected and preserved, both for the sake of future generations and out of respect for its intrinsic value. Before we engage in the issues at the heart of today's debate, we'd like to start by making clear the question raised by today's topic, which is, resolved, an overriding ethical obligation to protect and preserve extraterrestrial microbial life and ecosystems should be incorporated into international law. First, we will be arguing in favor of an overriding ethical obligation to protect microbial life, which is not the same thing as an absolute ethical obligation. Specifically, our position is that this obligation to protect extraterrestrial microbial life overrides the human interest in cheaper, faster space development. This means, for example, that we should bear the costs and accept the delays associated with sanitizing rovers to the maximum extent possible, identifying less invasive methods of exploration, and declining as a general rule to pursue space research and development that irreversibly threatens extraterrestrial ecosystems. Second, we note that the topic refers to microbial life in ecosystems writ large, not individual microbes. With this in mind, I'd like to discuss two reasons that we have an overriding ethical obligation to protect and preserve extraterrestrial microbial life and ecosystems: the extrinsic value of this life and the intrinsic value of this life. The extrinsic value of extraterrestrial microbial life stems from its potential future benefits to human society. There is an enormous amount to be learned from studying such life and the course of its development. New medicines, new insights into how life developed here on Earth, and much, much more. But none of this can happen if human development destroys or irrevocably alters the development of such life. We've all heard that those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. So let's consider the human history of exploration and colonization. Let's remember, for example, that from the extinction of the passenger pigeon to the hunting of blue whales to the brink of extinction, European exploration and colonization here in the Americas was accompanied by deforestation and despeciation precisely because a lot of people never considered their ethical obligations to future generations to preserve natural resources. Let's choose a different path. A path that ensures that future generations won't look back on the early era of human space exploration with similar regret. Second, in addition to protecting extraterrestrial microbial life because of its future value to human beings, we believe it should be protected based on its own intrinsic value. We submit that it is a core moral intuition that all life has at least some value. If you share this moral intuition about all life, I believe you can appreciate what a loss it would be to destroy extraterrestrial life representing an entirely different phylogenetic tree. Just as life here on Earth evolved from microbes, life on other planets could grow in complexity and scope in unpredictable directions. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you is a core ethical concept. If aliens had arrived on Earth billions of years ago, I think we can all agree that we would have wanted them to consider the potential of life on Earth before strip mining the planet. Today, we stand at a crossroads. We have not yet discovered extraterrestrial microbial life, but may sooner than we expect. Thus, we have the opportunity now to decide what type of legacy we will create for ourselves in regards to how we relate to such life. The right path is all ours for the taking. All we have to do is choose. Thank you.
Allow me to set the timer for a 3-minute cross-examination. Great. You ready?
Yes.
So you outline exactly what we're debating here today, and you read the topic for us.
Mm-hmm.
The topic includes a key word. It says overriding.
Yes.
So you understand that you are making the conscious decision that microbial life must override human life in some instances, correct?
Yes, so as we talk about at the beginning of the speech, what we're saying is that we are accepting the fact that at some instances it will be slower and more expensive to explore.
So it requires, a
that.
contrast between the two.
Absolutely.
Great. So you also understand that there's a certain level of sterilization that exists in probes that NASA has agreed is sufficient to continue our exploration.
Right, and as I
You've outlined, one sec,
Okay.
you've outlined that you agree that sterilization, even if it increases the costs, is a necessary cost.
Yes.
How much do we sterilize?
As we said in our speech, to the maximum extent possible.
Great. So Jim Watson, the current director of the Mars Exploration Program, said that Mars 2020, the next mission planned, is not sterilized to the maximum level because it would cause, quote, prohibitive delays. The affirmative accepts prohibitive delays in the face of
Delays that would
exploration.
make it take longer. Yeah, yes, absolutely. We think that those delays are worthwhile when it comes to these grand considerations of how we will be altering the entire path of those microbes' existence.
Great. So I want to contextualize these delays a bit.
Sure.
The probes that are sterilized to the degree, we don't choose to sterilize them to the same degree because it ruins some of the instruments on them. In fact, if we heat to the extreme temperatures or cool to extreme temperatures, the scientific inquiry we can make is simply impossible. That means the delays you're willing to accept are indefinite because we cannot use the same instruments,
In areas
right?
where there may be that life, those delays will be long, yes.
So can you give me an idea of how long it takes to have the next scientific breakthrough that allows us to have the same level of human discovery?
Well, I mean, a lengthy amount of time. We do think, though, that I think one clarification that needs to be made is that there is a contrast. There's not always a contrast between extraterrestrial interests and our interests. So there are instances of space exploration.
Great,
where
yeah.
there's
It's not
lower
like a
levels
negative
of
is going to say,
sterilization are
yeah,
okay,
the negative isn't
right?
going to say we should suddenly abolish microbial life. We
Right.
respect them as well.
Right. I'm
So
just
one other
saying-
quick line of questioning I want to discuss with the last 45 seconds here. There's a discussion about the level of sterilization that is necessary to prevent any sort of damage to the microbial life. That requires knowing there's microbial life on a planet. At what point do you determine a planet is free of microbial life such that your exploration would not inhibit its discovery and
I
development?
think that's a great question. I think what that comes down to is just knowledge within the scientific world that you can never be certain about anything, but there are ways of testing that you get to very high probability, and that's what we're saying. We need to get to that very high probability where everything we know and all of the evidence we have points to there being no life.
Great. So you accept the delays of probe sterilization, the probe of getting to that extreme probability that we've discovered in a planet in its entirety, and the delays of getting the instruments allowing us to send a probe to that planet that may have no life.
In instances where there would be conflicting interests, yes.
Thank you.
My name is Tyler Salath. I'm a current senior at George Washington University. I'll be beginning the negatives arguments in this debate. Thank you. The exploration of space has produced tremendous discoveries. The final frontier continues to offer limitless, untapped potential. Dramatic scientific inquiry explaining the origins of life, the potential to discover new sources of energy, and even offer a second habitat to humanity should something happen to planet Earth. To assure we continue to reap the full benefits of space exploration, Joseph and I stand firmly opposed to the topic that resolved in overriding ethical obligation to protect and preserve extraterrestrial microbial life and ecosystems should be incorporated into international law. Before discussing our more substantive arguments, we'd like to clarify a few questions about today's debate. First, today's resolution asks us to consider if we are able to derive any value from Mars if life is found there. The topic intentionally uses the phrase overriding, which implies a conflict between two opposing sides. Thus, it is insufficient for the affirmative to prove to you that microbial life has value. They must prove that that value of microbial life overrides the value that we could identify from human interests on Mars and other planets. We believe microbes should be treated ethically. As Dr. Kelly Smith, an astroethicist at Clemson University, notes, microbes can certainly have value, and we can recognize when microbial interests and human interests are placed in conflict, we should prefer humans. Put it another way, the negative certainly does not advocate for the intentional destruction of microbes, absent a weighted justification for why there is an alternative outweighing reason. When placed at these odds, human interests take priority over microbial interests. Humans have impressive characteristics like high levels of cognitive proficiency, empathy, the ability to both, say, respect microbial life and continue our space exploration. Perhaps an even starker example why human life is more important than microbial life is considering how often you wash your hands or sanitize your kitchen before you cook. You exterminate this life in order to be as safe as you go about your day. That is a conscious decision to favor human life over microbial life. Joseph and I would like to discuss one clear realm where space development proves to take precedent against an overriding ethical obligation to protect microbial life and ecosystems, space colonization. At present, humanity has all of our eggs in one basket, planet Earth. This is a dangerous gamble. A host of extinction-level scenarios that we ignore are in fact not so improbable. One example is asteroid extinction. It is not a question of if, but when. Dr. Verscher, a leading scholar in asteroid detection and research, noted that an impact can theoretically happen tomorrow, given humanity's poor investment in detection technologies. In a not-so-distant future, we will have the technology required to terraform Mars, granting humanity yet another chance. Importantly, colonization is far from the only benefit that we can glean from scientific discovery and investments. The inclusion of another regulatory risk, like international law, to have an overriding ethical obligation to microbes, reduces the likelihood that private actors continue their investments that have led to countless spin-offs in technology that we utilize daily here on Earth. The affirmative here draws a line between living and inorganic molecules and suggests molecules falling on the organic side of the line possess unique moral standing that outweighs human interests. I understand why this might seem compelling. It's a living thing, right? Well, it's essential to remember that when we are talking about living microbes, we're talking about very basic chemical reactions. and that the decision to draw the line between what constitutes organic and inorganic molecules is really quite arbitrary. Many organic molecules are no more complex or unique than inorganic molecules and deserve no special moral standing simply because they include a carbon atom or something similar. To delay the entirety of human advancement, new vaccines, cancer treatment, detection technologies, scientific discovery, on the assumption that such non-complex systems outweigh the value of our own well-being is dangerous. We could very well be trying to save a rock on Mars that would have the same basic organic compounds that many of these microbes that we try to save possess themselves. Finally, we believe the affirmative's faith in international law as a sufficient way to guarantee the effective enforcement of an overriding obligation is misplaced. Not all actors will join the resulting decree. In fact, the U.S. adopting these norms for NASA may place them at a strategic disadvantage to other space programs like China or Russia. Guaranteeing the enforcement of protecting microbes on planets away is tedious, may even encourage a form of space piracy where actors pay lip service to these protections and ultimately exploit planets regardless of the international law that was placed into effect. Ultimately, Joseph and I urge a negative ballot. We believe the topic calls on judges to recognize when two lives come into contention, microbial and human, which takes precedent. As microbes certainly can have value, but do not have an overriding ethical value when juxtaposed with human interests. The importance of scientific discovery, both for colonization and a host of spin-off technologies, should not be slowed or brought to a halt in order to value extraterrestrial microbial life. Thank you.
Okay. You ready?
Yep.
Great. So you talk quite a bit about the value that humans have compared to the value that microbes have, and I'd like to touch on this a little bit. What do you think gives human beings their special moral standing?
So a couple of the reasons that we isolated here, things like empathy, the ability to empathize with other beings in the world, our complex genetic makeup, the diversity not in just the compounds that are found in humans, but our ability to think critically, really.
Okay, let's start with the critical thinking and the empathy.
Yeah, sure.
A newborn baby can't really experience those things yet. Do you think they still have moral standing?
Well, a newborn baby would have the potential, right? There is a potential to think
Okay, how about a woman in
critically
a lifelong
the future.
coma? Would she have that potential?
Well, she had the potential. Her status as a human being, as a being
So, but
in
she
and of
doesn't
itself.
currently have it, but she still has the same moral
Well,
standing.
human beings possess the ability to think critically, even if some in the species do not.
Okay, that's fine. Let's talk about the idea of complexity. Let's say we have one human living alone in isolation and a second human comes in and lives with them. Has that system with those two humans thus become more complex?
The introduction of the same species to
Like another individual, do you think their interactions, their thoughts about each other, the way they react to each other, the way they develop because of each other, has that system become more complex?
There's definitely a more complex relation now.
Okay.
I don't think humans as a species have become more complex simply because we have two rather than one.
Okay, that's fine. Let's talk about the international law. And you mentioned that not everyone is going to abide by this law. Are laws against murder perfectly enforced?
Obviously not.
No? So would you advocate then that we should repeal these laws?
I believe the difference in this case is that a law against murder does not put those
fine,
who do not
but you
murder at a
wouldn't-
disproportionate
that's fine.
advantage.
That's fine.
This law would place those who follow the law.
Thank you. Let's talk about colonization and this argument you bring up about colonization. Your argument, when we think about how colonization works, how would we actually get to a Mars colony if we had it, for example?
Like, do you mean like transportation?
Yeah, what's the
of
transportation?
materials?
How does no, just like a person. How does a person get there?
Selected by NASA or the government to
Okay,
board
but
a
like
spaceship.
about how many can we send at once?
How many people we
Yeah.
could send at once? It most likely would be a small team
A
of
small
people.
percentage. Okay,
Yeah.
so if some disaster did happen here on Earth, most people would still go extinct, correct?
The argument is to preserve humanity as a
That's fine.
species. Obviously, we can't save every single person on Earth
Okay,
from the
let's
bad
move
things that
on
happen
to
there.
the exploration advantage. One of your arguments is about research, and outer space is pretty large. There's a pretty vast array of places that we can explore, correct?
Explore, sure. Terraform and colonize, no.
Okay, but I'm talking about the research advantage here now. There are places that we can still explore that that we're pretty sure do not have life, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so we can get scientific advances from that exploration, yes?
We would argue exploration in parts where we can apply, organic
That's fine,
compounds
but
to
there's
would
still, we have not
breed
exhausted
many
our
more
capacity
benefits.
for exploration in those areas.
No, we can still look
Okay.
at rocks, for example, if we wanted to.
When thinking about space exploration and the increasingly likely discovery of extraterrestrial microbial organisms, we as a society have to consider the potential risks. The risk that we permanently destroy the advances that future human generations could make. The risk that we fundamentally alter an entirely new branch of the phylogenetic tree. And the risk that we abuse microbial organisms and ecosystems beyond the point of no return. There are two main reasons we have an ethical obligation to protect and preserve extraterrestrial microbial life and ecosystems, and that's their intrinsic and extrinsic value. All life has value. We can see this here on Earth with the introduction of the Endangered Species Act. If the loss of an individual species here on Earth is such a tragedy, what about the loss of an entire branch of a phylogenetic tree? The loss of biodiversity if microbial organisms are decimated is huge because it's not just the species that's extinct. It's the possibility of the life that could develop from that branch of the species in the first place as well, and that includes more and more complex organisms than microbes. Extraterrestrial microbial life is part of an entirely different phylogenetic tree, and that's something we need to consider when exploring in space. Now, my opponents have argued that the distinction of where life begins is arbitrary because the chemical reaction is very similar to that of inorganic matter. However, they're not considering the larger picture. When dealing with extraterrestrial organic compounds, they could be non-carbon based. They're comparing this to a carbon system which we're not sure is comparable to what exists out in extraterrestrial organisms. And they're missing the key distinction. That's that microbial organisms have the potential for new life to evolve. There's the potential for an entirely new branch, and this is not something that we can write off as insignificant. And in addition, we're looking at entire ecosystems. A single microbe might not have a huge value on its own, but when we're looking at its species and how it interacts with its complex environment, it has great potential, and it's something that we cannot simply write off as insignificant. My opponent also spends a lot of time making the distinction between humans and microbes. However, as Maggie pointed out in her speech, we evolved from microbes in the past, and the potential for life is something that is very important to consider in this debate. The other source of value microbial organisms and ecosystems possess is their extrinsic value to humans. We don't deny that humanity can benefit a great deal from research and the study of microbes. However, without an obligation in place, we risk losing out on what we can learn about our history, our universe, and ourselves forever. We need to be sure that the way that we're conducting our research and reaping these benefits is done with our obligation to future human generations in place. It is our duty to make sure that they can benefit from microbial organisms and ecosystems too. Now, my opponents have advanced the argument that humans have much to gain from space exploration, mainly colonization and research. However, colonization is only successful if it is done sustainably. Without an overriding ethical obligation to microbial organisms, we risk permanently altering extraterrestrial ecosystems to the point where they are uninhabitable. Look at how we were using our natural resources here on Earth 200 years ago. What would be possible if we had treated our own ecosystem differently? Developing sustainability and with complete regard for how our actions affect the environment is crucial when thinking about colonizing, and this necessitates an overriding obligation to microbial organisms and ecosystems. And research is the same way. Scientific advances happen over time, and if microbial species aren't there in years when we have better and better technology, we're missing out on an infinite number of scientific advances that we could make. International law might not be perfect, but it's better than the alternative. We can't necessarily control how other actors will respond to this, and we can't necessarily control piracy. However, what we can do is create an international norm that sets the precedent for how future generations approach the issue. There might be an increased economic deterrent, but we need to consider if it's worth it. if it's worth having an additional deterrent in order to preserve a potentially new life form and infinite research benefits from it. You need to ask yourself, is it worth it? Is rushing into development without a sustainable plan worth the risk of permanently destroying life and potentially entirely new life forms? Is it worth disregarding our obligation to future generations and the potential that they could benefit from microbial organisms too? We should be focusing on benefiting in a sustainable way that recognizes this value of microbial organisms and takes care to ensure that we can benefit from them for generations to come.
Ready for some questions? I'd like to talk about just some of the reasons why you value microbial life.
Sure.
And the rationale behind that. Beginning though, we should not, for example, go to Mars simply because our mere contact with those microbes might disturb their ecosystems, correct?
That's not what the affirmative's saying. The affirmative saying is that if we go to Mars and discover microbial life, we should take all the necessary precautions that any research done there should be done in a sustainable way that doesn't harm the entire ecosystem.
Okay. My follow-up question to that, though, is that reason, though, for taking those necessary steps of precaution for being careful with the microbes, it's because of the massive benefits, the both extrinsic and intrinsic benefits microbial life might have for humans, for instance, correct?
Yeah, the extrinsic benefits for human and the intrinsic benefits of the life.
My question about that then is, how do you study microbes if we haven't interacted with them before in a way that you know will not harm indefinitely microbial life in ecosystems? For example, if you take a sample out of a ecosystem of microbial life, how do you, to study that life and ultimately preserve it, how do you know that won't indefinitely disrupt the ecosystem that you are trying to protect?
Sure. That goes back to what my partner was saying about scientific uncertainty. There's always going to be some level of scientific uncertainty, but in the affirmative, we are doing all of our best precautions to make sure that we're not negatively affecting the ecosystem.
It seems like this scientific uncertainty, though, even taking steps to preserve that or taking steps to alleviate scientific uncertainty still leaves it there. And in fact, it seems like you're just hurting scientific development in space while having no clear objective or no clear ability to preserve microbial life.
Well, I would argue that you're further hurting scientific development because you're creating a world in which we can wipe out entire species that we could benefit from for generations to come.
Okay, let's talk about inherent value then. What about microbial life makes it inherently valuable?
Sure, so that's its potential to develop into something else. We say that all life is valuable, but microbial extraterrestrial organisms are uniquely valuable because they have the possibility to evolve into life forms that we haven't seen before.
Okay, so the possibility to evolve into life forms we haven't seen before. You cited two things here, evolution, future evolution, and a phylogenetic tree. Humanity has its own phylogenetic tree, incredibly unique. Secondly, mosquitoes can evolve into something that we have never seen before. Why do we still stamp out mosquitoes when they bite our arms? Why do we still wash our hands to clear the microbes that might eventually evolve into something unique to preserve our health? Why wouldn't we just do that for Mars as well?
I think you're misrepresenting our argument. We're not saying that killing a single mosquito or washing your hands is not wiping out an entire species. We would say that wiping out the entire species of mosquitoes would be a bad thing for diversity. We're saying that it's not necessarily the same thing to compare killing one microbial organism when you're washing your hands versus killing an entire species out and out.
Sure, I'm not really talking about the effects here, more just your value judgments. You say something is inherently valuable because it has the ability to evolve, and that means that we put that above human life. Humanity still has the ability to evolve eventually into something that we have not seen before. Why wouldn't that mean we put humans before less complex microbes?
Well, we're also saying that the gains that you're getting from the way that the negative is approaching research and colonization are going to be hindered and not as beneficial as, say, the potential evolution of microbial organisms.
Thank you.
I'm Joseph Nelson. I'll be delivering the second negative speech and the final speech of this debate before cross-examination. The benefits that come from space exploration cannot be understated, both those of discovery and those of spin-off technologies. In a world of the negative, the continued benefits we've seen from NASA spin-off technologies like artificial limbs, Velcro, cancer detection, are all things that we want to continue seeing and continue bringing into fruition as quickly as possible to guarantee that human life, as well as any potential future generations of human lives, are protected. In a world of the affirmative, we are left in an area of paralysis where we cannot continue to have scientific discovery and scientific exploration. Throughout my speech, I'm going to advance two claims that I think are really important. First, the value of scientific exploration should not be unfettered, and in fact, a world in the affirmative makes it so that we cannot reap the same sorts of scientific gains. Secondly, the idea that microbial life takes some sort of interest that rises above humans and can be protected in forms of international law is a flawed assumption that only serves to reify the exact harms that the affirmative would like to prohibit. Now, let's first discuss exactly what the negative proposes. The affirmative would have you believe that we believe in the unfettered destruction of microbial colonies. That couldn't be farther from the truth. Tyler read evidence from Dr. Kelly Smith, an ethicist, who agrees that human lives take precedent over microbial lives, but despite that, you still treat them with ethics and respect. In fact, the status quo NASA policy, which I asked Maggie about after her first speech, does respect microbial life. NASA takes the scientific precautions necessary to guarantee that they don't launch probes haphazardly into environments that would endanger those colonies. When asked about the Mars 2020 mission, you heard from the affirmative that they would scrap it. They would wait for further forms of cleanliness and desanitation that simply we do not have the capability of producing in the status quo. That means there's a clear delineation between what the affirmative advocates of paralysis in scientific exploration, of waiting for technology that we don't know when it's going to come online, and the negative of respecting microbial life but still reaping the scientific benefits that we identify as incredibly important. Now, the affirmative tries to misconstrue this and say we can go to other planets, we can do other things. I want to read a quote that we just heard from Katie in her last speech. Quote, "The risk that we could permanently alter environments is enough of a reason." Think about that. The risk of permanently altering. It's true that a probe, even sanitized to the maximum degree possible, still isn't entirely clean according to NASA because we simply cannot reach complete sanitation levels. And that probe could cause permanent damage once it lands on a planet and perhaps wipe out because of a disease that we didn't anticipate causing the same sorts of haphazard results. Thus, the affirmative either A, agrees that we have to abide by scientific principles that NASA is abiding by in the status quo, or B, they lead us in a world of scientific paralysis where all discovery is ceased and we can't continue to have some forms of exploration. Either of those worlds, it's clear that the negative's standpoint of respecting microbial life while still guaranteeing to commercialize the benefits that we see are preferred. Let's talk about the discussion of the uniqueness of extraterrestrial life and why exactly you do prefer human life over it. Throughout this debate, we've heard a discussion of the phylogenetic tree, and we've heard a discussion of the difference between organic and inorganic life. Think back to the first life that existed. The scientists that the affirmative bases their claims on are scientists that also believe inorganic compounds became organic. There was some imaginary threshold that was crossed that delineated the two. In fact, biologists today, the father of biology, Edward O. Olson, has said the laws of physics dictate that there is still no complete difference between the two. Louis Pasteur, who created pasteurization, tried to prove that there's a difference between acidic and non-acidic life, saying that molecules that are organic can synthesize non-organic asymmetric molecules. That was proved false later when a scientist discovered succinic acid was able to do the same exact principles. And this cat and mouse game of trying to identify what an organic or inorganic principle is has played out throughout the entirety of scientific discovery. Hanging the hat of scientific exploration on tenuous claims to prohibit the advancement of humanity, all potential future lives that are advanced by cancer detection, is simply a claim that the negative says you should side with us. This plays into the international law claim, even if it is true that you should do your best to prevent destruction and sign them in international law. You create an incentive for discovery to keep it a secret and perhaps exterminate the life that could have existed in favor of protecting it or having some form of ethical standby that they have of the status quo that NASA policy dictates. Ultimately, you're faced with a decision. The decision to continue ethical exploration or the decision to cause a paralysis and deep delay of that analysis. We think you should agree with side negative. Continue the same forms of valuable scientific exploration. Thank you.
Are you aware that the Atlas bear has gone extinct due to the cause of human actions?
I am now.
Would you agree that that loss of diversity is a bad thing?
Sure.
Okay, what about the loss of an entire branch that stemmed from the Atlas bear? Would that loss of that be a tragedy?
Yeah, that's why we should treat other species with ethics, respect, and do the best we can to understand them, perhaps understand the environment of the Atlas bear to prevent it from going extinct in the first place, and not engage in intentional extermination.
Along that same line of thinking, do you think science and technology will be significantly more advanced 100 years from now?
Yes.
So wouldn't we have
In a
better
world of the
tools? Wouldn't we have better tools at the time to protect and preserve microbial organisms and ecosystems?
Potentially. But the same sorts of delays that the affirmative causes by not being able to sterilize instruments that are necessary for scientific inquiry would exist in those 100 years as well. The point isn't that the technology comes online eventually. The point is that you make it delayed so any potential future generation on Earth or elsewhere that could benefit from a vaccine or cancer detection is not able to do so.
Sure. So let's also consider, you mentioned something in your speech about in the world of the affirmative, missions would suddenly be unable to be completed. Why can't we just put into why is delaying a mission for sanitation and making sure that we're not harming microbial life the same thing as completely scrapping space exploration?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that. So the Mars 2020 mission that Maggie said would no longer occur can't occur under the sterilization principles that the affirmative has outlined because the instruments required to engage in the scientific inquiry are not able to undergo the sterilization necessary. In a world of the affirmative, that form of exploration ceases to exist.
Okay. So let's talk about your colonization argument. How far out would you say we are from being able to terraform a place like Mars?
Perhaps 100 years.
So then why does that process have to be started right now? Why can't we wait until we have more sustainable ways of approaching it? As you admitted, technology is going to be better in the next 100 years.
Yeah, two reasons. One is that it's not just colonization that you delay. You delay colonization as well as all the other host of benefits. And secondly, even if you delay colonization, you delay the technologies that would come online to allow us to engage in that colonization faster.
Sure. So let's talk about the research that we're delaying from sanitation. So how is that comparable to the research that would significantly change if a microbial ecosystem or organism species were to be decimated?
Yeah, so science is something that's brilliant in that it builds on other core principles. Colonization relies on the sterilization, relies on knowing the environment, relies on understanding the principles of Mars' surface. Those principles of understanding Mars' surface in a world of the affirmative where we can't use the instruments necessary to gain that scientific inquiry cease to exist as per our discussion of Mars 2020.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you to our debaters. At this point in the debate, the teams would normally present concluding rebuttals on each sides, their respective sides. We thought instead we might take questions from the audience, a few questions, if anyone has one. If you could raise your hand, I'll give you the microphone so we can get it recorded, and we hope everyone will introduce themselves as well. So, do we have any questions?
Thank you. My name's Kevin Flanagan. I enjoyed the debate very much. I have a question for Joe regarding Mars 2020, which came up several times. In your initial cross-examination, you said that the quote from Jim Wilson was that sterilization would be prohibitive for the 2020 mission. And later on, you came back to say more or less that it would be technically impossible, which seem two different concepts. In what way could you define, or did Mr. Wilson define what was in fact prohibitive? Was it prohibitive in time? This would be a delay of 5 years, couldn't be accomplished by 2020? Or in what sense was, what's the definition of prohibitive in this case?
Yeah, so Jim Watson, the head of the Mars 2020 program, when he outlined why it would be prohibitive, talked about the budget constraints in which NASA operates. It's no secret that NASA struggles to obtain the levels of funding necessary to continue the missions they want to see. Because of that, they constantly have to really set strict standards for the exploration that they can continue. When that quote was given, he said that it was in the context of costs would prohibit it from happening by 2020. That, however, the technical prohibitions that can occur from sterilization are also true. So the quote from Watson about Mars 2020 is about costs, but in the example of technical prohibition, you have forms of sterilization that wipe out instruments that we simply do not have the capability to undergo the high stringent standards that would survive into the hostile environments of what laboratories need to do to sterilize. So to answer your question, there are two types of prohibition, costs and technical. Jim Watson was talking about costs.
Thank you. I think we have one more question.
Hi, my name is Christian Kachin from the University of Pennsylvania, and my question's to the positive team. You talked about how we have to do everything we can to preserve these natural ecosystems, but what moral obligation do we have, if any, to protect them from a natural extinction event? And how would a natural extinction event be different than, let's say, another species coming over and destroying, like, taking over? Isn't that natural in some sense, as far as we know? So I want to know what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I would say that in the context of this debate, we would consider the obligation to be an obligation to protect from our own interference. So, and in some ways, protect and preserve can be kind of contradictory in that way, but we view it as not interfering with what would be that natural development, because we do see that natural development as part of the evolutionary process, and on a planet that would, as we've been allowed to evolve naturally, we think that is within the rights of all living beings. So we would see it as protection from ourselves, not from protection of natural extinction. I don't know if you have anything you'd like to add.
Yeah.
No?
Hi, my name is Ashley Garrett, and I am from American University, and I have two questions for each side. For the negative, you talked about how exploration of Mars and everything would be great for advancing humanity and having another place where humans can go just in case something happens to our planet. The Industrial Revolution ended up causing a lot of problems in our planet, and it has triggered off a number of differing problems, including developing countries that continue to use less environmentally friendly technology. How can we prevent that, or how will we even protect this possible new colony or this possible new planet from happening or having the same outcome as Earth? Are we just going to be going from planet to planet, ruining them and their ecosystems?
Can take that. That's actually a great question, something that we've come to grapple with a little bit. It seems like for that to take place, for humanity to have the option to go to another planet and to be able to take those resources, this debate needs to happen first, which is kind of the centerpiece to that debate. But the question and the intent of the question is completely correct there. There would need to be some sort of cognizant mind shift change to help that sort of consumption focus, because you're definitely right. The position that the negative team takes in this debate is one of, continue scientific development, continue to reap the benefits for humanity, and not to let microbial life get in the way. So that's something that would need to be grappled with.
Yeah. I would just add one small thing and say that that question actually gets at things that are outside the context of this debate, because even if you adopt the world of the affirmatives idea that you respect microbes and you don't want to lead to their destruction, the sorts of causes that lead to irreversible damage that you described from the Industrial Revolution are inherently human values. So even if you protect microbial life and the microbial life continues to prosper, humans could still have forms of destructive habits that would lead to the destruction of the environment of Mars. But all the more reason why, as Tyler said, it's good to have debates like this.
Okay. For the affirmative, I was wondering if there is a law that is put into place, how are you going to prevent black market or different types of illegal activities or other countries not following protocol?
Sure. So we got into this a little bit, but it's we come from the position that in some terms it's impossible to prevent all forms of countries not complying or of black markets bringing up, but putting this into place does more benefit than harm in the long run, because having that sort of international norm is going to prevent certain countries that do follow international laws from going and destroying microbial organisms. But I think to a point, it would be how we enforce international law today to the best of our abilities.
What government body would be overseeing this, or will there be like space lawyers or anything like that?
Well, I think a lot of international law right now in terms of space, comes from all of the countries that currently have space programs working together to establish space norms. So laws about how we use the moon, for example, and how we use other areas of space are from those countries. And I think in our ideal world, we would hope that countries that in the future could also have space programs would be included in that as well. So it's not just like current hegemons. But right now, that's how it works, is people who have the capability. Did you want to answer?
Yeah. I actually learned this from these debates at the University of Washington. I can't claim to be smart to know the following claim. The UN has a series of articles that outline exactly how this would take place and govern exactly what sorts of norms and how precautionary you need to be if you approach microbial life. I'm not exactly sure if spacefaring nations, as Maggie said, have signed on or how seriously they're taken, but I do know that the UN has been the de facto body for discussions at the international level of spacefaring nations. So, conversation that needs to continue, perhaps through the UN.
I have one more question. I don't know. I don't believe that you guys had defined microbial life in your arguments, and I'm wondering if there's a distinction between sentient microbial life, if that's a possibility, versus non-sentient microbial life. Like we talk about bacteria and viruses that aren't necessarily as we would define sentient. But if we did come across a sentient microbial life, does that debate then move on to not just microbial but just other sentient beings? I guess it would be for the negative. And how do you navigate that? Is that a separate debate, or do you have subsections of that?
So for the purpose of these debates, we tried to focus the debate to get that high contrast on non-sentient microbes on Mars and other planets versus human interests. We thought the distinction between conscious human beings making decisions and then a non-conscious, non-sentient microbe would be stark and would be important to make. So that's what the debates are about. It's about microbes, bumping into each other, not having a path of their own, or I guess having a path but not knowing where they're going. But you're right. If the debate were to change and they'd be higher forms, more evolutionized forms of life, then that would change the ethics debate entirely. Something that we haven't really thought about yet, just because the focus has been on microbial life and ecosystems.
I think too, just on that most of the research we've done, there seems to be a pretty, as far as we're aware, broad consensus that when we do find life, it will be non-sentient. So we're trying to base these debates as much as possible in the existing literature on what it would look like. So that's one of the reasons that the conversation has centered around non-sentient beings.
Thank you, everyone. This concludes the debate and question and answer period. If you're interested in the debate series or more information, I suggest you take a look at the website, nasadebates.org, for videos of other debates, interviews with topic experts, and a schedule of upcoming events here in DC and other places across the nation. Thank you all.